heavy and suffocating, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Outside, the streetlights hummed faintly, their glow spilling weakly through the curtains. Inside, Ollie sat at the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the open suitcase on the floor. His hands rested on his knees, trembling ever so slightly, though he tried to steady them. The room was filled with a strange stillness, but beneath it, tension coiled like a storm, waiting to strike. Sarah stood in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, her face set into a mask of cold determination. She didn't fidget, didn't waver, didn't blink as she uttered the words that cut through him like a blade. "Pack your things," she said, her tone sharp, final, devoid of emotion. "You don't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, echoing in his mind over and over again. He turned slowly to look at her, searching her face for some flicker of hesitation, some trace of the woman he had once loved so fiercely. But there was nothing, no softness, no kindness, not even pity. Her eyes were cold, and her lips pressed into a thin line, as though every trace of love had long since vanished. Ali's chest tightened, and he felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. This was the woman he had built his dreams around, the woman he had stayed awake for nights planning a future with, who once laughed at his jokes, who once leaned on his shoulder as though he was her safe place. And now she stood across from him like a stranger, casting him out as though he were some uninvited guest. For a long moment, he couldn't move. His body refused to obey, his mind still trying to deny what his heart already knew. This wasn't a fight that would end with reconciliation. This wasn't one of those arguments where hurtful words were spoken and later forgotten. No, this was final. She meant it. His eyes dropped to the half-packed suitcase at his feet. Shirts, folded in a rush, some wrinkled, some stuffed carelessly, as though even the fabric carried his turmoil. He remembered how carefully Sarah once packed for him when he traveled for work, slipping notes of encouragement into his bag. He remembered how she used to hold his hand when he left, telling him to come back safe. And now, that same hand, those same lips, had become instruments of dismissal. He reached for another shirt, his hand trembling as he stuffed it inside. Each motion felt heavier than the last, as though the suitcase was not filled with clothes, but with pieces of his heart being torn away. The silence between them deepened, broken only by the faint sound of zippers and fabric rustling. His mind replayed every moment of their shared life, memories flooding him like a cruel tide. The late-night walks under streetlights, the promises whispered in the dark, the small kitchen they once dreamed of replacing with a bigger one. He remembered the nights when they had nothing but hope, when they would eat simple meals together, and laugh about the future they were certain was theirs. He thought about the sacrifices he had made, the extra hours at work, the things he gave up just to provide for her, for them. And now it all seemed like a cruel joke, the foundation of their life crumbling beneath his feet with just a few words. "Sarah," Hal finally said, his voice low, broken, almost unrecognizable to himself. "After everything, this is how it ends." She didn't flinch. She didn't even soften. Instead, she let out a small sigh, as though his words were nothing more than an inconvenience. "It ended long ago, Ali," she replied flatly. "You just didn't see it. Don't make this harder than it already is. Just go." Her tone was so matter-of-fact that it stunned him more than if she had screamed or cried. At least anger or tears would have meant there was something left between them. But this emptiness in her voice meant she had already moved on. Ali lowered his gaze again, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Pride kept him from begging, though his heart ached. Love chained him to her even now, but dignity forced him to keep silent. He folded the last of his belongings into the suitcase, zipped it shut, and sat still for a moment, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. He wanted to tell her how much he had loved her. He wanted to remind her of who they had been, of the promises they had once made under starlit skies. He wanted to ask her what went wrong, what he had done to deserve being cast aside, but the words burned in his throat, refusing to come out. What good would they do now? Taking a deep breath, he rose to his feet, lifting the suitcase by its worn handle. His knees felt weak, as though the weight of the bag had transferred itself into his bones. The sound of the zipper sliding shut echoed in the room like a death knell. He glanced around one last time, his eyes lingering on the walls that had once heard their laughter, on the framed photographs that now seemed like relics of a past life. He paused at the doorway, standing close to her, close enough to see the faint trace of indifference in her eyes. He had never felt further away. For a brief moment, he thought she might say something, anything that might show a spark of what they once had. But she didn't. She simply stepped aside, her arms still crossed, her expression unmoved. Ollie walked past her without a word, his suitcase dragging behind him with a dull thud against the floor. Each step felt heavier, final, irreversible. The hallway stretched before him like a tunnel of shadows, each step echoing loudly in the silence. When he reached the front door, he hesitated. His hand rested on the handle, trembling slightly. This door had once been the entrance to his sanctuary, his safe place, and now it had become the barrier pushing him out into a world of uncertainty. With one last deep breath, he pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a sharp sting that made his eyes water. Or maybe it wasn't the wind at all. He stepped outside, his chest tight, his throat aching as though he had swallowed fire. Behind him the door shut with a hollow thud, the sound of finality, of a chapter closing. Ali stood there on the porch for a moment, staring at the dark street before him. He had nothing but a suitcase and the pieces of his broken heart. The home he thought would be his forever was now behind him, and he was nothing more than an exile from the life he had fought so hard to build. With slow, deliberate steps he walked away, each footfall heavy, each breath laced with pain. The house loomed behind him, fading into the shadows. But the echo of her words remained carved into his soul. You don't belong here. And though he did not yet know it, those words, the ones meant to break him, would one day become the fire that forged him into someone far stronger than either of them could have imagined. The sound of polished shoes echoed against the marble floor, each step deliberate, powerful, echoing through the vast expanse of the mansion's grand hallway. Ollie walked slowly, his posture straight, his gaze steady, as though he belonged to this place more than the chandeliers hanging above or the golden frames that lined the walls. The air was scented faintly with roses from the gardens outside, a fragrance that used to remind him of someone else, of a life that felt so far away it was almost unreal. This house was his now, every inch of it, from the ornate staircases to the sprawling lawns that stretched into the distance, carried his mark. Once upon a time he had been forced out of a place that wasn't his, cast into the night with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. Now he stood in a palace that dwarfed everything he had ever dreamed of. Years of sweat, endless nights of work, sacrifices that had nearly crushed him, each one had led to this moment. He had clawed his way out of the shadows she had thrown him into, and now he stood in the light of his own making. The heavy front door creaked open, its hinges groaning as though even they recognized the weight of the moment. She stepped inside hesitantly, her figure framed by the tall doorway. Sarah. Her eyes swept across the hallway, widening as they traveled over the intricate designs carved into the walls. The glow of the chandelier crystals catching the light, like falling stars, the sheer scale of the space that seemed to stretch endlessly around her. She looked small here, diminished, her confidence faltering as she took in the grandeur of what he had built. This was not the modest home she had once shared with him. This was something greater, far beyond anything she had imagined. And then, her eyes landed on him. Ali stood near the velvet sofa, his hands resting calmly on the polished wood railing of the staircase. His face was unreadable, carved into a mask of calm strength. He didn't rush toward her, didn't speak first. He let the silence weigh heavy, let her take in the transformation, let her feel the irony of standing on ground that was now his. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grand clock that stood tall in the corner, its pendulum swaying back and forth as though measuring the gravity of the moment. This place, she whispered finally, her voice trembling with disbelief. You own it. Ollie leaned back against the sofa, his movements slow, deliberate, controlled. He gave her a faint smile, not one of arrogance or cruelty, but one that carried the calm authority of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Yes, he said simply, his voice steady, deep, resonant. This is mine. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She seemed lost, her gaze darting around the room again, as if hoping the walls themselves would tell her she was mistaken. But there was no mistake. The evidence was all around her, the wealth, the power, the success. She remembered the night she had told him to leave, remembered the sharpness in her own voice when she said he didn't belong. She had thought it was the end for him. She had believed he would crumble, fade into insignificance. And yet here he was, not only standing tall but thriving in a way that made her knees weak. Ali's eyes never left her. He studied the shock on her face, the regret that was beginning to bloom, the flicker of realization dawning in her eyes. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel bitterness. Those emotions had burned away long ago, replaced with something colder and stronger. Resolve. Funny, isn't it? He said quietly, his tone measured, controlled. This is the place where you said I didn't belong. You told me to pack my things, to leave, and I did. I walked away with nothing but a suitcase and my pride. His words cut through her like shards of glass. She swallowed hard, unable to look him directly in the eye, her fingers twisting nervously in front of her. He continued, his voice unwavering. But I didn't break. I didn't stop. I built something greater than either of us could have imagined. I fought through nights you'll never know about, sacrifices you'll never understand. And now, he gestured slowly around the vast mansion. Now this is mine. Every wall, every light, every brick. I own the very place you once thought was too good for me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain, but no words would come. What excuse could possibly undo the truth standing before her? She, that had cast him aside, and he had risen higher than she ever believed he could. Ollie straightened, his gaze sharp, piercing. And the irony, he added, his voice soft but heavy with meaning, is that this is where you belong now, not me. The silence that followed was suffocating. She felt small, insignificant, swallowed by the weight of her choices. The man she once dismissed as unworthy now stood as a testament to resilience, to strength, to triumph. She had told him he didn't belong, but it was her who seemed out of place now, standing in a home that reflected none of her sacrifices, none of her struggles. Her eyes glistened, though she tried to hold the tears back. "Ali," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." He lifted a hand, stopping her words cold. "You didn't want to know," he said firmly. "You made your choice. And that choice gave me the fire to become who I am today. So, in a way, I should thank you." The words crushed her, though he spoke them without malice. They were true, and that truth weighed heavier than any anger ever could. Ali turned away slightly, his gaze drifting to the tall windows where sunlight streamed in, painting the room in gold. He no longer needed her validation. He no longer sought her love. He had already won, not by taking revenge, but by becoming the man she never believed he could be. Sarah stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, her heart pounding in her ears. She realized then that she no longer had any power here, no claim to the man before her, no place in this empire he had built. Ali walked past her slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he reached the doorway, he paused, his voice calm, but final. "This house, this life, it's mine now. I belong here. You're just a visitor." And with that, he stepped out onto the terrace, the sunlight catching his silhouette, leaving her standing alone in the vast hallway. Irony hung in the air like a cruel twist of fate. Once she had told him he didn't belong. Now, it was she who stood in a place that was no longer hers, staring at the man who had risen beyond her reach. The mansion seemed to close in on her, its grandeur mocking her regret, its silence reminding her of all she had lost. She didn't need him to say it aloud. The truth was written in every corner of the place. He now owned. She was the one who no longer belonged.